The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Courtroom 3B as the morning docket proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Judge Margaret Harrison presided from her elevated bench, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose as she reviewed the next case file. The gallery held the usual mix of attorneys, plaintiffs, defendants, and curious onlookers who found themselves drawn to the daily theater of local justice. Near the back of the courtroom, a man in his 70s sat quietly in the third row. His worn leather jacket hung loose on his thin frame, and a walking cane rested against his knee. His left leg bore the telltale signs of an old injury, positioned at an awkward angle that spoke of reconstructive surgery from decades past. Thomas Mitchell had arrived early, as was his habit, carrying a manila folder containing documents he hoped would resolve a simple disability benefits dispute that had dragged on for months. The case before his was wrapping up when the bailiff called his name. Thomas Mitchell versus the Department of Veterans Affairs. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, the walking cane providing necessary support as he made his way to the plaintiff's table. The opposing counsel, a sharp-dressed woman in her 30s representing the VA, shuffled through her papers with obvious impatience. Your Honor, the VA counsel began. This case involves verification of military service for disability benefit eligibility. Mr. Mitchell claims service-connected disabilities from Vietnam, but our records show inconsistencies in his documentation. Judge Harrison looked down at Thomas with professional courtesy. Mr. Mitchell, do you have identification and service records to present to the court? Thomas nodded respectfully and reached into his manila folder with slightly shaking hands. He withdrew a weathered military identification card, its edges soft from years of handling, the photograph showing a young man in army dress uniform from 5 decades ago. As he held it up, several people in the gallery craned their necks to see. That's his military ID? Someone whispered loudly enough for the front rows to hear. Looks like something from a costume shop. A snicker rippled through the courtroom. The woman next to the whisperer nudged her companion and pointed at Thomas's walking cane. Probably bought that at a surplus store, she muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. The VA counsel glanced back at the gallery with a barely concealed smirk. Your Honor, as you can see, the plaintiff's documentation raises questions about authenticity. We've seen numerous cases of fraudulent military identification in recent years. More laughter bubbled up from the gallery. A man in an expensive suit leaned forward, studying Thomas with obvious skepticism. Vietnam vet, right? Half these guys never left the States. The comment drew nods and more whispered commentary from those seated nearby. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks but kept his expression composed. He had faced worse humiliation than this courtroom mockery, though it still stung after all these years. He simply held his military ID steady, waiting for the judge to examine it properly. Judge Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she listened to the gallery's disrespectful murmurs. She had been on the bench for 22 years and had seen enough genuine heroes to recognize one when she saw him. Something about Thomas Mitchell's quiet dignity and the way he carried himself despite his obvious physical limitations reminded her of her own father, who had served in Korea and never spoke of his service except in the most general terms. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. May I examine the identification, Mr. Mitchell? Judge Harrison asked, extending her hand. Thomas approached the bench slowly, his cane clicking against the marble floor with each step. He handed over the military ID with the same careful respect he had shown it for 50 years. Judge Harrison took the card and immediately noticed details that others had missed. The photograph showed a young soldier with sergeant's stripes, but it was the unit designation that made her pause. 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile. She had read enough military history to know that particular unit's reputation in Vietnam. The card itself bore security features that would have been impossible to replicate outside of official military channels. As she examined the ID more closely, she noticed something else. A small notation in the corner indicated special clearance levels that were typically reserved for soldiers involved in classified operations. Her father had carried a similar designation during his service in Korea, though he had never explained what it meant. The gallery continued their whispered commentary, emboldened by what they perceived as the court's tolerance for their skepticism. That walking cane is probably just for show, someone said loud enough for Thomas to hear. These fake veterans always overdo the victim act. The VA counsel sensed the crowd's support and pressed her advantage. Your Honor, without proper documentation verification, we cannot substantiate Mr. Mitchell's claims. The department has strict protocols for preventing fraudulent benefit claims. Judge Harrison set the military ID down on her desk and reached for her computer keyboard. She had access to military databases through the court's security clearance system, a tool she rarely used but kept available for cases exactly like this one. As she typed Thomas Mitchell's name and service number into the secure database, she found herself hoping that her growing suspicions about this man's true identity would be confirmed. The search results began populating on her screen, and Judge Harrison's eyes widened as she read. The first entry showed Thomas Mitchell, Sergeant First Class, United States Army, service dates 1968 to 1971. But it was the subsequent entries that made her breath catch in her throat. Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against hostile forces in Binh Dinh Province, Vietnam. Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor in combat operations. Purple Heart Medal for wounds received in action against enemy forces. Combat Infantryman Badge. The list continued for several more lines, documenting a level of service and sacrifice that few soldiers ever experienced. Judge Harrison scrolled further and found classified mission summaries that had been declassified only in recent years. Sergeant Mitchell had been part of long-range reconnaissance patrols deep behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence on North Vietnamese troop movements and supply routes. On 3 separate occasions, he had remained in position under heavy enemy fire to call in artillery strikes that saved the lives of his fellow soldiers. The most significant entry detailed an action from March 1970, when Sergeant Mitchell's patrol had been ambushed by a superior enemy force. Despite being wounded in the initial engagement, he had single-handedly held off the attackers while his team evacuated 2 critically wounded soldiers. He had continued fighting for over an hour before reinforcements arrived, sustaining multiple wounds that would affect him for the rest of his life. The database also contained medical records documenting Thomas's injuries. Shrapnel wounds to the left leg requiring multiple surgeries. Hearing damage from prolonged exposure to artillery fire. Traumatic brain injury from an explosion that had knocked him unconscious for 3 days. Each injury was thoroughly documented and verified by military medical personnel. Judge Harrison looked up from her computer screen to see Thomas still standing quietly at the plaintiff's table, enduring the continued whispers and snickers from the gallery. The VA counsel was shuffling through her papers, preparing what appeared to be another challenge to his credibility. In the gallery, the expensive suited man was holding court with his theories about veteran fraud. These guys all have the same story, he was saying to anyone who would listen. Combat hero, wounded in action, deserves special treatment. It's all calculated to manipulate the system. A woman near the front row nodded along. My nephew did a tour in Afghanistan, she said, and he came back just fine. All this post-traumatic stress and disability stuff is mostly in their heads. They just want free money from the government. The VA counsel stood to address the court again. Your Honor, given the questions surrounding Mr. Mitchell's documentation, the department requests additional time to conduct a thorough background investigation before proceeding with this case. Judge Harrison had heard enough. She closed the database screen and picked up Thomas's military ID, holding it carefully as she prepared to address the courtroom. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim slightly as she stood, her black robes creating an imposing silhouette against the wood-paneled wall behind the bench. Mr. Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet courtroom, please return to your seat. I have reviewed your identification and accessed your military service records through official channels. The gallery sensed a shift in the judge's tone, and the whispers gradually died away. Even the VA counsel seemed to recognize that something significant was about to happen. Judge Harrison stepped down from the bench, still holding Thomas's military ID. She had never done this in 22 years on the bench, but she had also never encountered such blatant disrespect for a genuine American hero. She walked slowly toward the gallery, her footsteps echoing in the now silent courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. I want to share with you exactly who you have been laughing at for the past 15 minutes. The man standing before this court is Sergeant First Class Thomas Mitchell, United States Army, 1st Cavalry Division. She held up the military ID so the entire gallery could see it clearly. This identification card is not fake. It was issued by the United States Army and contains security features that cannot be replicated outside official military channels. But more importantly, the man who carries it earned every honor and recognition contained in his service record. The expensive suited man shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Judge Harrison continued. Sergeant Mitchell served 3 tours of duty in Vietnam between 1968 and 1971. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, our nation's second-highest military decoration, for extraordinary heroism in combat against enemy forces. The woman who had complained about veteran benefits stared down at her hands as the judge's words cut through the courtroom like a blade. He was also awarded the Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor, multiple Purple Heart medals for wounds received in action, and numerous other decorations recognizing his service and sacrifice. Judge Harrison turned to face Thomas directly, her voice softening with genuine respect. On March 15, 1970, Sergeant Mitchell's reconnaissance patrol was ambushed by a numerically superior enemy force in Binh Dinh province. Despite being wounded in the initial engagement, Sergeant Mitchell single-handedly held off the attackers while his team evacuated 2 critically wounded soldiers. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on the judge's words. He continued fighting for over an hour, sustaining multiple wounds that required extensive medical treatment and affect him to this day. His actions that day saved the lives of 6 American soldiers who returned home to their families because of his courage and selflessness. Judge Harrison walked back toward the bench, Thomas's military ID still in her hand. The injuries you see today, his need for a walking cane, his careful movements, these are not props or attempts to gain sympathy. They are the visible reminders of wounds received while fighting for the freedom and security of every person in this courtroom. She turned back to face the gallery one final time, her expression reflecting decades of judicial authority and personal conviction. I have been privileged to serve on this bench for over 20 years, and I have never been more ashamed of behavior I have witnessed in my courtroom than I am at this moment. The VA counsel sat frozen in her chair, realizing that her entire case had just evaporated under the weight of documented heroism. The gallery members who had been laughing just minutes before now stared at Thomas with mixtures of shame and newfound respect. Judge Harrison returned Thomas's military ID to him with a gesture that resembled a salute more than a simple handover. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, "your service record speaks for itself. Your disability benefits claim is approved in full, and this court extends its deepest gratitude for your service to our nation." Thomas accepted his military ID with steady hands, his quiet dignity unchanged despite the dramatic reversal of the courtroom's atmosphere. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said simply, his voice carrying the same measured strength that had sustained him through decades of unrecognized sacrifice. The judge addressed the VA counsel with barely contained authority. "Counselor, I suggest your department review its procedures for verifying legitimate service records. This case should never have required judicial intervention to resolve." As Thomas gathered his papers and prepared to leave, several people in the gallery approached him with quiet apologies and expressions of gratitude. The expensive suited man remained seated, staring at his hands, while the woman who had questioned veteran benefits wiped tears from her eyes. Judge Harrison returned to her bench and called for a 15-minute recess, needing time to compose herself after witnessing such a powerful reminder of why respect for those who serve should never be taken for granted. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the impact of those few minutes would remain with everyone present for years to come. Thomas Mitchell walked out of Courtroom 3B with the same quiet dignity he had carried into it, but now his sacrifice had been recognized and his honor restored. The fluorescent lights continued buzzing overhead, but the atmosphere had been forever changed by the presence of a genuine American hero who had finally received the respect he had always deserved.